Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to give us an overview of intact forest landscapes and the context of them. The situation now is we are in a climate emergency. We're in a biodiversity crisis. We are breaching the safe operating space for life on Earth. We're breaching 4 of the planetary boundaries. We're in a very serious situation. Deforestation and forest degradation is involved in all of those 4 breaches, or 3 of them anyway. And so, it's never been more critical for us with forests than now. Motion 65 came in 2014 to try to find a way through for FSC to prioritise the protection of these areas and to support the protection of them. It's not a new debate in FSC. I mean, FSC debated about primary forests right from the beginning and didn't actually find a very good framework, and then had to rethink it in 98, 99 to come up with the high conservation value framework, which under HCV2 is the large landscape level forests in IFL. So it is not a new thing for FSC to struggle with this issue of how can FSC protect primary forest and intact forest areas. After the motion, I guess, was passed, and it's been supported externally by the IUCN amongst others as well to prioritise the protection of intact forest landscapes. FSC needs to do everything they can to protect IFLs from a climate and from a biodiversity point of view, and also from a rights and Indigenous livelihoods point of view. The challenge we have, of course, is how to do that, and that's the struggle that we've had and we've seen from the Motion 34 report backs, the difficulties that there are in the regions, in the tropical regions in particular, for implementing the motion, and how difficult that is for the concession holders. So we understand that. So I think let's think and really be creative about ways that we can address those challenges. And I think one of the key ones that is obviously being talked about is really to think beyond the concession boundary, to think about the jurisdiction or the landscape as a whole, and how can we work with the stakeholders in the landscape to protect the IFLs as a whole, because IFLs are larger generally than concessions, except for maybe some very large concessions in Africa, for example. But generally, they're only part of a much larger whole, IFLs. And so for FSC to succeed and to meet its goal of protecting IFLs, it has to work together with others in the landscape to achieve that, with governments, with the communities and the Indigenous people, with everyone in that landscape. And so I think that, to me, is the one interesting angle that FSC can really take up. And it's not really new. I mean, if we did try this actually back in 2009, we tried to take a landscape approach to protecting IFLs. We had a meeting in Cameroon to discuss this type of approach with the concession holders and with other stakeholders there. Unfortunately, we didn't find a way through it, but at least the idea is there, I think, and landscape approaches are much more developed now. So I think that's, to me, is a fruitful area where FSC could play a facilitation role, or a role to get parties together at least, and try to think about how to achieve this goal of 80% protection, protection of the core areas and so forth. So yeah, maybe I'll get your thoughts on that, Al, on a landscape approach for FSC to take that up.
Thanks, Grant, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Yeah, and I'm looking at this from a board perspective, and what's also recently repeated in our revised global strategy. And Grant clearly nailed the 2 biggest dilemmas we're facing now with the climate change issues and the loss of biodiversity. We all believe that healthy and resilient forests are going to be a key to helping address those 2 major concerns we have. So going forward, I believe what we've heard at the board level is not a concern with IFLs in that regard. We all believe that these high-value forests, high conservation values, are indeed critical going forward. What I think has happened is, on the practical end, as concession holders, organizations, countries, regions, I believe they really challenged with the phrase inside the management unit, because it kind of, as Grant says, doesn't really factor in what's going on at the proper landscape level, which should be grounded in an ecological basis for that territory, that geography. What's going on outside? How do we partner with like-minded organizations outside as well, governments, other concession holders, other land uses even. And that's also been clearly written in the global strategy to forge these partnerships. So we're kind of excited, to be honest, that we're starting to think beyond what we thought we could actually do. We only really thought for a long time our influence was on this small territory. But on the optimistic side, what we've heard from so many regions is many times governments have done a lot of good work outside these management unit boundaries, and we'd like to see some level of recognition for that. That'll build trust to go a long way, and really look forward to what we're able to do inside this Focus Forest project, and work with these regions to come up with what we hope will be very creative solutions that allow us to move forward. So back to you, Grant.
Yeah, I think that's great, Al. I think there's a lot of potential there. The Focus Forests initiatives that are underway, I think, open some doors for us to look at ways of doing that. The developing tools to do that. I'm interested, particularly anyway, at the impact on Indigenous peoples and communities in those landscapes, and how we can bring them in and as partners in the protection, and really address the incentives and benefits, I guess, or if your degree of protection is limiting the ability to manage or use a forest, then there should be some compensation for that. And I think that's, we really need to dig into looking at those aspects. Otherwise, we're not going to get protection done. That's not going to happen, and really need to look at that and those aspects. And this is partly why we have proposed a motion around financing for intact forest landscape protection, or at least to incentivize it, and particularly to support communities and Indigenous people, which are effectively doing something for the greater good. I mean, this is the protecting IFLs is for the climate and biodiversity, for the greater good of the global community. And I think local people shouldn't be penalised for taking that action. So I think that's one angle that really FSC could explore more, was to really look at how to get financing for conservation, really, rather than just staying in the box of, oh, we have to log the forest to protect it. No, there's a lot of other ways to look at the values that are in the forest, and to look at the ways of really supporting that conservation. Another idea, I mean, I know a number of concession holders are under tax pressure, or they have fees to pay and things like that. So maybe there could be negotiations around concessions for taxes, or if there are volume targets that need to be met, then maybe they can also be renegotiated as well, and FSC could support that. So find some other ways to deal with this, rather than just sticking in the where we've been stuck now, which is a concession trying to harvest the forest, and how does it do it with IFLs in it. So I think we need to think much more broadly and creatively than how we have been so far.
And the thinking creatively angle, Grant, I think is exactly what we need to do. I've been trying to listen a lot to people around the world, and I think I've learned a couple of things, and of course there's always more to learn. And there's a few things that come to mind. A good ecologist friend of mine mentioned about when we look at intactness and IFLs in general, we tend to look at them as a binary, or it's either an IFL or it isn't. And maybe as we look into that, we can look at two things. One, the degree of intactness, because in my 30 odd years of being a practicing forester, I've seen all kinds of forests. I'm sure I could tour people through and they would never know that there was commercial activity there decades ago. But still, we know there's ecological things that we need to look at. So that could be a good angle. And one that we talk about that we didn't really implement very well yet is the idea of restoring features within these IFLs. This is, of course, a decade of restoration. I've seen examples where other industries, say like oil and gas or mining and that, have left some disturbances on the ground that end up with linear features, which are not good for when trying to protect some other big ranging species, and predators can now get around way too easy and see way too far. So if we can factor in that concept, I think that'll create some boundaries as well. And then the last thing I think that's really helpful is not all forests, of course, are created equally and grow the same way or behave the same way. So if we can ground all this, as you say, with indigenous traditional knowledge of areas and how they have stewarded the land for generations, that would be helpful, and are also our ecological knowledge. I just happen to live in an area that is heavily disturbed by wildfires, and there's things that we can learn there. It's not a simple matter of why do these areas burn, but the more we listen to local folks, I think we can really look hard at how we can come up with some creative solutions, I think. And at the end of the day, what grounds us, of course, is what's best for the wildlife in the area, the biodiversity. We have to reverse this trend of 50+% of animals disappearing and species being put on the threatened lists and worse. We have to reverse that, and we have to contribute, of course, to the human effects of climate change, and forests are a great contributing solution to all of that. So and this is what I'm really excited about going forward. Is we don't want to lose why we're trying to do this, but we're now opening up our thought patterns to a lot more than see what we've done in the first few years. So thanks.
Yeah, I agree, Al. And I mean, your point on restoration, I think, is interesting. You know, we have lost the majority of intact forest landscapes globally already, and as you say, the job in hand is for the climate and for biodiversity is we really need to restore a lot of what we've lost, and some of these features, like you say, you know, the forests are changing with the climate, but we also need to really look after them better if we're going to survive climate change. And I think, yeah, it's an interesting problem, I guess, we have to, when you've got a complex set of both ecological interactions, you know, fire being a natural feature, as well as human interactions, and where do we draw the line with what's intact and what's not. And I think the focus of protection has always been categorized as IUCN categories 1 to 3, which is relatively strict protection. And I think we've always actually, you know, often promoted also category 4, which is these community protected areas. We have a degree of use as long as you're protecting the values that are there. So I think we need to think a bit more outside just the narrow sort of strict protection box that we've been sitting in, and think other ways to achieve the goal that we want, which is protecting the values. And I think also, just to add, I think infrastructure and roading is a particular issue that has to be dealt with, and it's often, you know, targeted as when intactness is broken, it's often the infrastructure that does it, you know, a road going through an area or something like that. And so looking at the role of roads and how that can be addressed, you know, the impact that it has on wildlife, for example, in Africa, quite huge, you know, and as you say, our forests can recover. I mean, nature's amazing. It can recover. Sometimes you can go to these areas and it's very hard to tell whether harvesting has been there or not, you know, and certainly how long. And so things can recover, I think, if we create the conditions for recovery. So just thinking through these issues, yeah, keeping with the goal of really trying to protect these IFLs will help us through in the future.
It's really key, I think, Grant, is as we look at solutions to IFL tend to be solutions for other values. I remember early in my own career, I think I unbuilt more roads and built new ones because we were mostly concerned about watershed management and clean water and water quantity as well. So maintaining natural drainage patterns, minimizing siltation, and we know how to do a lot of this work in a lot of areas. So as we look to get that wildness back into the forest, we're also helping watershed values, we're also helping wildlife values. So these things do compound in a good way, and there's so many smart minds out there in our in our concession holders, with our stakeholders, clearly grounding all of this is the local knowledge of communities and the Indigenous peoples who live there. I think this is a really helpful discussion now because we've been so polarized for so long and kind of lost our vision of what we're trying to do. One thing I think I've learned being on the board all these years is we have so much more in common than we initially think. And as soon as we listen to one another a little bit longer than normal, we quickly find that out, and the solutions are a lot more achievable than we thought. So I think this is a very helpful way going forward.
Okay, thanks, Al.